Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's get started and look into the first article. The first article is speaking about information warfare. We've had issues with China along the border areas. This also led to death of about 20 Indian soldiers. They were killed by the Chinese soldiers. The Chinese were active militarily and also killed the Indian soldiers militarily. This is one side of the issue. The other side is what is called as information warfare. What is this information warfare? Use of social media like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter to bring up and create a new type of narrative or a perception across the world is what is called as information warfare. So basically, when you are speaking about information warfare, it is use of information technologies, equipments and its systems to build a narrative which can be counterfeit in nature, or you're building a misinformation so that you can represent your adversary in a very bad light. There are two ways of introspection when it comes to this particular information warfare. We have what is called as information protection and we also have what is called as information attack. What is this information protection? This is basically defensive in nature. What do we mean by it? This means, let's take a simple example of India and China. China does not allow any of the foreign companies to operate in China. They have their own social medias like Weibo. Facebook does not exist. Even if that exists, they operate in virtual networks. So what does the Chinese do? They completely control the information. So any injustice, any illegality that is committed by the Chinese government against its citizens will not come out. So all the information that the Chinese want about China and their perception from the outside world is completely filtered out. So there is information filtering that happens. So what happens in information protection? Basically, there is protection of information from the Chinese government, and only those information which the Chinese wants, only that will be allowed to enter the Chinese frontier. Then what we have is called as the information attack. This is basically offensive in nature. What do we mean by it? Let's suppose this is also called as information manipulation. What is this information manipulation? Basically, there is alteration of the information with an intent to distort the opponent's picture of reality. So basically, the reality will be something, but what is created is something else. So there is a false narrative about the adversary that is created by one of the adversary country. How is this manipulation done? This is through the use of social media or by use of advanced technology. Internally, they may not be able to use the social media, but externally, in case they want to manipulate the data, that information can be put up on all the technological upgradations using the graphics, video, audio editing and other information as well. Let me give you a simple example. China's coronavirus information warfare is one such example. We know for the fact that this coronavirus emanated from China. We also know from the fact, because they were not able to give requisite amount of information on the right time, the world is suffering because of COVID-19. But how does China manipulate it? It creates doubts about the origins of the virus, and China has also demonstrated its effectiveness in managing the crisis. In case someone questions them, they are coming up with a suitable answer for the same when it comes to the COVID-19. So the information warfare is basically about, one is on protecting their own stance, and at the same time it is also about offensive strategy where it is about condemning another adversary in the present reaction. Let me also give you another example of information warfare which can be linked to psychological warfare. Abhinandan sir was caught by the Pakistani army. He was taken into captivity, and immediately after that they also started posting videos on social media. It was as if that Pakistan did not want any type of war. Such was the perception created by Pakistan during that particular crisis. India did not want any war, but Pakistan also created such a scenario or such an image that it did not want any type of war. Now let's go back to Kargil. During Kargil, Saurabh Kalia was one of the soldiers who was killed by Pakistan. He was tortured, and that is how psychological warfare works. So basically, information warfare is another part of psychological warfare where you create a perception, you create an image, you create a narrative about what what you perceive is right, putting the adversary in a negative position. That is one type of story. The other issue is, let's take the example of India-Nepal border issues. We did have the India-Nepal border issues very recently. So what was being done is that one side we have the Chinese, on the other side we also have the Pakistanis trying to create an image that India is not at all helping Nepal, but at the same time it is Pakistan and China who have always been the friends of Nepal. So immediately when this perception is created, people in that country go against India, and in the near future there could be a possibility of political backlash as well. Such is the narrative when it comes to the information attack, or what is called as information warfare. What is the whole modus operandi of this particular issue? When it comes to the military analysts, they basically say, because of increasing relevance of information technology, all of us start using the mobile phones. We have access to YouTube, we have access to Facebook, we have access to WhatsApp. Information warfare is inexpensive, as targeted party can be delivered a paralyzing blow without spending a single rupee. So the whole issue is, without spending anything, they are creating a psychological blow to the adversary country. What could be the implications because of this information warfare? Pakistan and China have been very active in giving out political misinformation. They use religion, they also use race for their own advantage to bring internal divides, and at the same time to also gain political mileage externally. They are also able to twist the facts as well, with reference to Bangladesh and also with reference to Nepal as well. So when there is this mispresentation, their people go against the country, so we will lose out on the political will as well. So there is a political party. If there are certain number of people become part of this political party and go against the narratives of India, India would not be able to have a very good relationship with that country. One such example is Nepal in the present scenario. And at the same time, attaining information superiority also becomes very important in the present generation. Why? As much as air superiority, water superiority and military superiority, we also have to create a narrative, a image about our own country. If this perception is bad, if we are put in a negative limelight, the other adversary country can take advantage, and as a result there will be many other countries which would be supporting their cause. So what we need to make sure is that we also have an important informational advantage as well. We also have to create our own narratives and perceptions, and that is why India has also taken certain important steps as well. The Defense Ministry has also approved a new information war branch in the army to combat any type of misinformation or the false propaganda that is being spread through the social media for any type of psychological warfare, as we did see in Abhinandan sir's case. Therefore, this information warfare is creating an image, generating a narrative, and also coming up with a perception so that they can attract countries and global community towards each other without even firing a single bullet or continuing any of the hard power stances. What is the present context? Many of the Chinese accounts that mushroom on the social media during India and China clash was not operated by the Chinese, but instead it was from the Pakistanis, who were wanting to create an image perception which was negative in light with respect to India. That is why we have taken this particular article, which basically speaks about information warfare and perception management. To give you a simple example, there could be a profile something similar to this, where there could be people who would create a fake profile in the name of the Chinese, and they would propagate hate against India to create a negative image about India. This might be genuine or not, but there could be similar activations of fake accounts to generate a negative image of India, is what this article all about. Now let's look into the next article. This article says the significance of Chardam board verdict. The entire article is not required for the examination perspective, but what is required for the civil services, such parts will be discussed in this discussion. we have to understand there are two important articles when it comes to the right to practice of religion, and that is Article 25 and another is Article 26. Article 25 basically speaks about individual rights, and few cases it also speaks about group rights, and Article 26 speaks about the group rights when it comes to the religion. Before we understand what this article is, let's go back to a bit of history. India is a pluralistic society. We have number of religions in India. It is also inhabited by number of people of many religions. Constitution therefore makes it very clear that India is a secular country. When we say about secular country, the state will remain neutral in all matters of religion. Equal treatment will be given to all religions as well. The same was also reaffirmed in SR Bommai case, where it said that respect for all faiths and religion is a matter that the state will have to do, and at the same time, and the state does not identify itself with any particular religion. Now let's understand what is Article 25. Article 25 speaks about freedom of conscience, free profession, practice and propagation of religion. When we speak about Article 25, the first important word is about conscience. So what is conscience here? Conscience is nothing but what you assume God to be. This is an absolute right. Why is it absolute right? Because the state cannot interfere about your thought process. You may assume God to be formless. You may assume that God has a form. You may say that God is this, the God is that. So what you internalize within your thought process, that is what is conscience. So basically, when you're speaking about conscience, it's an absolute right where no one has any business when it comes to your fundamental right. So that means this article as a whole is not absolute, only the freedom of conscience is absolute. Then we have the free profess. So what do we mean by professing? Let's say I am a Muslim. So I am proclaiming that I am a Muslim, or I'll say that I'm a Christian, a practicing Christian, or I can be a proud Hindu as well. So professing is nothing but declaring your one's faith in the general forum. Then you also have what is called as practice, which means you can perform the homas and avanas, you can go to mosque, you can go to the church and also attend the mass as well. You can also go to the dargah, you can also go to synagogue as well. So going and performing these acts is what is called as practicing, and at the same time you have what is called as propagation. So what is propagation here? Let's say for example, you are conducting conferences, you are conducting debates, you already have Ganesha festivals, you also have Durga festivals, you also have Muharram processions as well. So this is what is called as propagation. So this propagation does not mean you have the right to also convert. This is ultimately prohibited, and the same has been established by the Supreme Court as well. So right to propagate is conferred by the Constitution of India, but this does not mean that one can convert another person. There is a thin line of difference here. Let's suppose I am a practicing Hindu, but I do not want, or I feel that there is something where I have discovered in Buddhism. So can I convert myself independently to Buddhism? Yes, I can do that. If there is no pressure from the outside forces, or I'm not being pulled towards another religion, or if I am taking an independent stand for myself without any pressure from the outside forces, I can convert to another religion. That does not mean that someone else can force me and pull me towards the religion. So basically, voluntary, no one will interfere, but in case there is force, that is not let under the propagation. This entire Article 25 is also subject to the public order, morality and health, and to the other provisions of the fundamental rights as given in the Constitution. In case there are any of the issues with respect to this, the state can interfere when it comes to the religious organizations, and at the same time social welfare and reform or throwing open of Hindu religious institutions of public character to all classes and sections of the Hindus also performed under Article 25. Historically, there were certain castes who were not allowed to enter the temple. In case there is any such prohibition in the temple, the state can directly interfere and can make sure that such temples are open to all castes and so on. When can the center enter? When can the state enter? Or when can the judiciary enter? Can they enter in all paradigms? No. This is where the Supreme Court has established what is called as essential religious practices. So what is this essential religious practices? Let's say for example, in religion you can break break them into two important fundamentals. One is called as religion function, the other is secular function. The religious aspect is what is also called as the core function. The secular aspect is what is called as the non-core function. So what is this core function? Let's say for example there is a temple. In temple there are reading of Vedas that happen. Can the state interfere? Can the judiciary interfere? No, they cannot. Whether the Vedas has to be read in a temple or not will ultimately be decided by that particular temple. Or let's say there is azan that happens. Azan is an integral part of Muslims. So is the state interfering here? No. 5 times worshipping is part of Muslims as well. It is an inherent part of practicing Islam. Can the state interfere here? No. Going to mass is an inherent part of, let's say, Christianity. So in all these core aspects, the state and the judiciary can never interfere. But there is something called as the secular practices. Let's say for example, untouchability is a secular practice. The state can interfere, and that is what we also mean by opening or reforming the Hindu system. Then we also have the sati system, which is not a part of it. Or let's say we speak about triple talaq. It is also not part or inherently an association with Islam. So in all these secular aspects, the state and the judiciary would be able to step in, but the same cannot be interfered when it comes to the religious aspects of Article 25. Now let's also look at Article 26 as well. This is basically speaking about the group affairs. Let's read Article 26. Freedom to manage religious affairs. Every religious denomination or any section thereof shall have the right to establish and maintain institutions for religious and charitable purposes, manage its own affairs in matter of religion, to own and acquire movable and immovable property, to administer such property in accordance with law. This is basically speaking about Article 26. When you're speaking about Article 26, you have a word called as religious denomination. What is a religious denomination? It can be Muslims, it can be Hindus, it can be Christians. So those people who have a particular collection of individuals who want to practice certain spiritual practices, they come under one particular cloud called as religious denomination. Then you have what is called as common organization. Let's say for example I build a temple, that itself becomes a common organization where people wanting to follow certain spiritual practices come under the common organization. They need to also have a distinctive name. That is when a denomination comes into picture. Therefore, with respect to Article 26, I would be able to establish a religious institution. I would be able to manage its affairs. I would also be able to buy the property, both movable as well as immovable property, and that will be administered by a law. In case there are no established principles as to who established it, we do not know there are any people who have actually established it. In that particular condition, we have the law that can take precedence. In the present scenario, we have something called as the Uttarakhand Chardham Devasthanam Management Board Act of 2019. According to this particular law, the temple management was being controlled by the state. So the petitioner had a simple question. The state has no role when it comes to the Uttarakhand temples. Why? Because this is a religious practice and the management will have to be controlled by the people of that particular religion. This was the petitioner's argument. But what did the court say? The court clearly said that establishing and maintaining will go together, which means a religious denomination can claim to maintain only those institutions which it has established. Only when it is established and maintained is when 26 of A comes into picture. If it is not established, we do not know who established it. In such a scenario, the law takes its precedence, and the law of the land, the legislature would be able to make the law, is what this Uttarakhand judgment all about. But kindly remember, the state is also entitled to regulate the administration of religious or temple properties by means of a validly enacted law. But at the same time, it cannot completely shut the management. Why? Because this is also being maintained by the Hindu denomination. So they can maintain it, but if they have not established, then 100% maintenance might not be given, is what this article all about. Rest of the things is not important from the civil service examination point of view. This is all is required. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article here is speaking about reviving the Indian economy. The COVID-19 is bleeding the economy. The world is entering a deep phase of recession as well. There are two important factors. One is on the external front, the other is on the internal front when it comes to the households. On the external front, what we see is unemployment. Companies are not working. Lockdown has also been enforced. There have been companies which are shut because they are not making profits, and ultimately people do not have jobs, and this has become a greater disaster of COVID-19. It also means that it also drives hungry stomach. People do not have enough of food to eat, and what they are also scared is that what could be the possibility of economic impact on the economy. So on one side you have companies, you have organizations, you have industries which are not hiring people and instead is firing people because of less profits. On the other side you have people who are also not spending in the public forum. Why? Because they do not know what could be the consequences of tomorrow's COVID-19. As a result, there is complete lack of encouragement both from the industry side and also from the people side. This is where the article goes on to say that we have to inspire the people and also inspire the industries. The article here drives two important narratives for the people. What are these narratives? One, it is speaking about NREGA program. It also says cash support will have to be provided the people. First, let us speak about NREGA. This was one of the landmark schemes introduced by the UPA back in the year 2005, headed by the Congress. It was introduced in 2005. Why? Because they basically wanted to prevent the migration that was happening from the rural sector to the urban sector. The other important idea was to provide guaranteed unskilled manual labor for all those people with minimum wage supply. This also mandates that about 33% of the participation for the women as well. So basically all those people who want job, the job would be guaranteed to them for the unskilled labor. This will include work such as water conservation programs, land development, drought proofing, and many other manual work which is taken up in the rural sector. In the present scenario, what this particular NREGA has done, it has provided one of the bedrock of support during the COVID-19 is the first set articulation. So going forward, the government will have to support more of MNREGA work so that people do get the employment opportunities, do get the money, and they are able to buy the goods is one such argument. The second argument is with respect to the cash support. This cash support is basically in line with the universal basic income. There is something called as the qualified universal basic income. What is this qualified? There are certain people who already have enough money. They do not require any type of income from the government or the subsidies from the government. They are completely eliminated. Then there are poor people. Then there are hunger people. Then there are poverty struck people. They are into unorganized sector. They do not have any other sources of money, and all that they live is on daily incomes. In case there are such people who have lost their jobs, provide them basic minimum income which is called as the cash support. In case this cash support is given by the government, they would have money at their disposal, and this will what will make them spend, and ultimately there will be demand, and this will be commensurated by supply as well. So what is the logic here? The logic is government will have to provide the cash support. But there is a negative concern as well. What is the negative concern? In case the people are provided this cash support for a very longer period of time, they would get used to this particular money and they would not enter the labor market. And as a result, industries will not have enough number of people. They would not be able to find job for the people, and at the same time, industries will start bleeding because labor force will not take up all these jobs. Why? Because the government is already giving them the money, so why would they work out and sweat out to get this money from the industries? This is one such argument that is put out. But according to the article, there have been examples from the United States of America where, in spite of USA providing these type of free cash, cash support, the same people are also wanting to go back to work as well. So when the COVID-19 is shut, when the activities resume, people will not stick back to the government subsidies or the cash support, but instead will go back to the labor support or working, is the argument put forward by the author. The government has also taken number of schemes and programs, and that is on the monetary level and also on the fiscal level as well. Let's suppose the interest rate reduction or the credit guarantee liquidity enhancement schemes at the fiscal level and also at the monetary level with the help of the RBI. So the government has done all this for the people so that resumption of the activities take place. But unfortunately, what is happening is there is no demand from the people. People are not ready to spend money, and the banks are also not ready to provide loans as well. Why are they not ready? That is because they are not confident of lending. In case they do lend to people and the people do not actually pay back their loans, it is the banks who will suffer. So what do the government have to do? They have to make sure that the management is given freely and professionally to the public health sector. Insolvency process have to function smoothly, and at the same time they have to make sure that they take the confidence of the people while bringing into picture the new type of reforms. How do we establish it? That is through the government actions. So what are the government actions? One is by higher borrowing. The government of India would be able to borrow from the World Bank or from any of the international banks at a very low rate. So what should the government do? They should borrow money from the World Bank and actually start spending at the local level. They should not concentrate too much on the deficit in the present scenario. In the future they would be able to compensate for the losses, is one such argument. And the World Bank would really be happy to help India. Why? Because we have been an impeccable borrower in the past. We have no defaults, we have always paid the amounts timely. There is full transparency when it comes to the conduction of our activities. In case this is not possible, the government can also look at the option of printing money, not now, only as the last resort, says the author. When we have no other options, when all other options are exhausted and dried up, that is when printing money can be taken up as a last resort. The government, when it starts printing, it will also start expanding its expenditure as well. It will start boosting the income of the private people, and this also fuels the inflation. Inflation is good for the economy, as this basically means it is encouraging the business activity. But the government will also have to make sure when to withdraw excessive cash from the economy. In case it persists and if there is more money, this could result in more inflation, and ultimately it could harm the country as well. So what we have to understand overall is that the government will have to take innovative and bold measures, not take the deficit into picture right now, as we would be able to manage in the near future. So we have to restore the confidence in the people, restore the confidence among the bankers, restore confidence among the businesses, restore confidence among the international organizations. So when we are able to drive all these together, we would be able to make up to the COVID-19 losses, is what this article all about. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article here is speaking about the national education policy that was unveiled by the government. We have been discussing from the past 4 to 5 days about this national education policy. We spoke about the significance of it, how it will transform the Indian education system, what could be the challenges with respect to its implementation, and what needs to be done as a way forward as well. In this article, we will focus on the draft notification as mandated by the Kasturi Rangan Sir committee. What was present in the draft and how is the present policy different is what we are going to compare. There are 4 important statements or dimensions that we have to compare with respect to the draft as well as the actual policy. When it comes to the draft, it had made a clear statement that commercially oriented private institutions will be closed, and that is missing in the final policy. Though the 2020 policy has clearly said in case there are any substandard institutions, such substandard institutions will be shut. Then what we have is another important paradigm with reference to the draft policy. It also spoke about doubling the public expenditure on education to about 20% of the government expenditure from about 10%. This is not present in the present policy. The draft policy had spoken about it, but the current policy only speaks about 6% of the GDP, that which should be accommodated with the education sector. A few other recommendations of the committee did also not find a place in the final policy. Let's take the example of the National Education Commission. This was supposed to be established, and a similar state level operation and a commission was also to be present. This is not present in the final policy. The draft notification had also come up with a beautiful suggestion, and that was doing away with the affiliating system. We have number of colleges which are affiliated to different universities. It can be the Delhi University, it can be Anna University, or it can be Mysore University as well. Colleges will now not be affiliated to these universities, but instead will become autonomous, which means there would be institutional and faculty autonomy, and they would be able to design their own programs as well, and they would also be able to provide degrees on an autonomous basis. The same has been implemented by the government under the new education policy. However, how will this be implemented? Because in the past, the policymakers and administrators have suffered to implement it. How will this be unfolded in the near future is what we have to wait and watch. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this issue. But for the rest of the issue, kindly look into our past 1 week CNA. Now let's look into the practice questions. Consider the following statements with respect to the Wancho tribes. They are located in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. Wancho language belongs to the Tibeto-Burman family. Which of the above statements are correct? The answer to this is both. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. They are the tribal people inhabiting the Patkai hills of Longding district in the state of Arunachal Pradesh. Their language belongs to the Tibeto-Burman family. When it comes to their religious practices, they together follow what is called as the belief of animism, and tattooing plays a major role among these particular community. The prime festival of this tribe is called as Oreo. The Wanko are traditionally governed by a council of elder chieftains who are called as Wangam or Wangsa. Now let's look into the next practice question. Srimo Shastri Pact is related to, is it related to river dispute between India and Nepal, hydropower project agreement between India and Bhutan, agreement to restore Hindu temples in Pakistan, or an agreement in determining the status and future of people of Indian origin in Ceylon? The answer is agreement in determining the status and future of people of Indian origin in Ceylon. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. This was an agreement that was signed between Prime Minister Srimavu of Sri Lanka and Shastri Ji from India. What is this pact all about? You have number of people from India, especially from the state of Tamil Nadu, who were taken to Ceylon, that is Sri Lanka. These people were employed in tea estates, coffee estates, as well as other plantations as well. So basically, these were Tamilians who were in Tamil Nadu, and they were taken to Sri Lanka. Under this particular pact, there would be repatriation of all those Tamil speaking people in Sri Lanka. So they are advised to go back to India, and that included about 5,25,000. So 5,25,000 Sri Lankan Tamils will go back to India. That is one of the treaty clause, and at the same time there are few people who can stay back in Sri Lanka, and the Sri Lankan government will also provide citizenship to them. So basically this has two important clauses. One is about Sri Lankan Tamilians who will go back to India. The other is Sri Lankan Tamilians will be provided citizenship in Sri Lanka. Another important pact was also called as Srimavo Gandhi Pact as well. A similar clause was also laid in the Srimavo Gandhi Pact. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into the next practice question. Polonnaruwa recently seen in news is in which country? The answer to this is Sri Lanka. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. Kindly remember, this was the second capital of Sri Lanka after the destruction of Anuradhapura in the year 1993. Polonnaruwa was first established by the Cholas. Because it was the Cholas who established it, there could be a possibility of this question question being asked in your preliminary examination. So the Polonnaruwa was first established by the Chola dynasty after successful invasion of Sri Lanka's then capital Anuradhapura in the 10th century. This is also known for rock-cut Buddha sculptures and ancient city, now a World Heritage Site. Now let's look into the next practice question. Consider the following pairs: Mukurti National Park, Telangana; Kaundinya Wildlife Sanctuary, Karnataka; Dibru-Saikhowa National Park, Assam. Which of the above pairs are correctly matched? The answer to this is 3 only. Why? Mukurti National Park is not in Telangana, but instead it is in Tamil Nadu. Kaundinya Wildlife Sanctuary is not in Karnataka, but it is in the state of Andhra Pradesh. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. Kindly remember, Mukurti National Park is located in the Nilgiris district of Tamil Nadu, and Kaundinya Wildlife Sanctuary is a wildlife sanctuary and an elephant reserve situated in Andhra Pradesh. Now let's look into the next practice question. Which of the following is or famous for the sun temples? Arasavalli, Amarakantak, Omkareshwar. Select the correct answer using the code given below. The answer to this is one only. Arasavalli has the sun temple. That is the only place in this particular answer which holds good. So the answer to this is one only. Arasavalli Sun Temple was established in the 7th century, and this is in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and this is believed to be built by Devendra Varma, who happened to be the king of Kalinga dynasty. Now let's look into the next practice question. This practice question was discussed on 31st of July. We also gave you an answer for this particular question, that other than resistance to pests, what are the prospects for which genetically engineered plants have been created? The answer that we gave was 1, 2 and 4. This is perfectly fine as per the UPSC answer key. But there are recent updates and developments as well. According to these developments, to enable them to grow and do photosynthesis in spaceship and space stations are also right. So in case there is any question on similar lines, the answer going forward would be 1, 2, 3 and 4. As per the UPSC answer key, 1 to 4 is right, but as per the recent updates, the answer should be 1, 2, 3 and 4. Now let's look into the mains practice question. What do you understand by information warfare? Will it control the form and future of war? Critically analyze. As the COVID-19 enhances economic disparities and pushes the threshold of inequality, reviving growth and economic activity will require bold and innovative measures from the government. Discuss. So please write all your answers on the comment section. Peer review, come up with constructive criticism. So this is it for today. Thank you for watching. All the best.